All right, welcome everybody. As folks start to join the space, welcome to Diversity and Leadership Connect with Community 2020. This is the session where we get to talk about our First Generation Low-Income Club, one of our newer clubs on campus. We are so thrilled to have them, and we are so thrilled to have you here as well today. I'm gonna actually turn the session over to one of the people on campus that I am so incredibly honored to work with. She is someone who inspires me in the work I do every day and reminds me how powerful the MBA experience can be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Valeria.
Oh my gosh, well, thank you so much. And welcome everybody. So excited to be here. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce myself before handing it off to the panelists to introduce themselves. I am Valeria Martinez, or Val for short. Pre-GSB, I lived in Los Angeles, so shout out to all the SoCal people out there. Favorite thing about the GSB so far, gonna be super cliche, but it's honestly the people. I've made some incredible friendships here at the GSB, and some people here know me better than my own family, and I come from a very large Mexican family that is very tight-knit, so that's saying a lot. So I'm going to hand it off to Mike and Ariba to go ahead and introduce themselves.
Thanks, Val. Welcome, everybody. My name is Mike Kobiela. I'm an MBA 2 here, one of the co-presidents of the club along with Ariba. I wish we could see you guys in person, but we're glad you're here. I am originally from Chicago, and I grew up in Chicago, but I've spent the last couple of years in San Francisco before the GSB. And I'll hand it off to Ariba.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariba. I was born and raised in Pakistan, and I moved to the States 8 years ago for school and lived in New York City before moving to San Francisco Bay Area for school. And I think one of my favorite things about the GSB so far is the Fly community and the Fly Club. So very grateful for Mike, Valeria, and the rest of this crew on campus.
Awesome. Thank you both. So we're going to start off with some prepared questions for you all, and then we'll do that for about 15-20 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A, so you can use the chat feature to go ahead and ask us any questions that you'd like. So let's get started. This one's for you, Mike. Can you tell me about Fly and what kind of events or activities does Fly host?
Yeah, so Fly is a community for people who identify as first gen or low income or as an ally. It's a pretty new club. It really started the year before we got here, and we've sort of been focused on growing it and building a bigger community. Right now, we've got probably around 40 to 50 people who are actively engaged, which is about 10% of the class that comes to these events, which I think is really exciting. And of course, it's been a little bit different in COVID times than maybe it would be in a traditional year. In the past, we've brought in speakers, we've had kind of happy hours and group events to really kind of form that social fabric between students who have similar backgrounds and similar identities. And frankly, you know, being from the background that we are, you know, there's certain things we think differently about, certain risks we can be afraid to take, certain ways that we set our ambitions. And I think having a community for folks like us is really, really powerful. This year, we've changed focus a little bit more onto the community building because of the challenges of COVID. So we're doing a lot of kind of small group events, a lot of dinners, a lot of virtual kind of support groups, and really just finding ways to build those relationships and welcome new MBA students in, even though it is kind of a more challenging year.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. This question is actually going to be for the both of you. So what are some recent topics Fly has been engaged with? Ariba, maybe we start with you.
Sure. I think there's a lot of overlapping identities that we see on campus when you look at the Fly community. So there are people from obviously across both genders. There are people from across racial and ethnic backgrounds. There's a bunch of international students that come from a first-generation low-income background. And a lot of the discussions recently have been around kind of the complexities of having those overlapping identities and navigating all the tough stuff that comes with that. Some of us have talked a lot about being an international student and being first-gen low-income and making compromises on the kind of career paths that we can pursue, given that we might be supporting family or we might be looking for a work visa right after we graduate. We've talked about budgeting on campus. There's obviously people from all different walks of life at the GSB, and some have more dispensable income even at school than others. And so how do you afford to pay rent? How do you have a social life and also, budget effectively? How do you send the amount of money that your parents or your siblings expect you to send every month back home when you're a student? So lots of conversations around overlapping identities and lots of conversations around just building financial agency for ourselves and our families. Mike, anything you want to add?
That's a great list. There isn't much to add. I would say maybe a little bit more on kind of career and managing finances. I think there's a lot of research out there that shows that people with a FLI background tend to actually be weirdly less successful, especially if they disclose that identity to employers. And so I think a lot of conversations also revolve around kind of like how we position ourselves and where we set our goals to be, as well as I think a lot of kind of the tactical nuance of, how do you come to GSB and spend $250,000 that you probably don't have to come here, and then spend more money on top of it to be a part of your class and really get the same experience that your more privileged classmates do. I think that's kind of the other kind of big topic that we're constantly chewing on.
Yeah, thank you, Mike and Ariba. That's great. Great context for folks. Curious if you can both share a little bit about how you got involved with FLI and what made you want to take a leadership role with the organization.
Yeah, I can maybe start there. So like I identified pretty strongly with this background. So my story, I was actually born in Poland and emigrated to the US when I was 2 years old. And my parents, even though they were well educated in Poland, none of that kind of qualified here and was counted. And so my dad's a truck driver and my mom started out as a janitor. And so I realized when I came here that I'm actually from a very wildly different background. And even though I've been in the professional world for a few years and can sort of fit in when I need to, I also was really looking for a place where I could be totally honest and kind of find other people who are asking the same questions that I am. It definitely found it. So I think, there's a lot more focus on diversity in admissions for things like MBA programs and representation, at every step of your career for more, socioeconomic diversity. And I think it starts here. It starts by creating a place where people know they belong and wherever you're coming from, finding the support, finding a community. And so it's kind of a no-brainer to come in and help this club grow, because as you'll find out if you're considering MBA programs, you're only here for 2 years, and 1 year you're a student, and the next year you're a leader on the things that really matter. And for me, this felt like one of the most important things to spend my time on.
Yeah, I think Mike did a great job explaining the reasons why some of us joined the club. I think for me, it was interesting to come to business school, like Mike said, and realize that the people who are most visible often early on in business school tend to be of a certain demographic profile. Like oftentimes it's the people who are playing the most beer bong or who are like organizing the most trips. And it's very easy to feel invisible if you're female, if you're a woman of color, if you're an international student, if you're one of the only Muslim students on campus in my case. I think there were moments when I felt very alone and isolated in my identity and in my body and skin tone and all of that. And so for me, joining the FLI Club was really a way to put myself out there and be really visible early on as a student leader, so that other people who enter the GSB and who feel alone and isolated can kind of look at, a crew of us and say, actually, there's people like me here. And so it came down to representation and visibility in large part, and also just kind of keeping the community thriving and growing, like Mike said, because there are a ton of us out there. It's just that, like Mike said, there isn't always space for us to truly talk about our backgrounds.
Yeah, that's great. And if I can add my 2 cents here. So I'm also also first generation, grew up low income. My parents, immigrants from Mexico. My dad came to the States, started off as a janitor, at a large printing and graphic arts company. And so we were very measured in terms of what we could spend growing up. And some of that mentality still applies to me today as I'm thinking about, am I going to go on this trip? Granted, last year pre-COVID, am I going to go on this trip with friends, or am I going to choose to stay on campus and enjoy, quite frankly, everything that Northern California has to offer? And I think that you're going to find pockets of people at the GSB that fit into every kind of mold and every spectrum in terms of spending and hobbies and activities. And so this is certainly a place that is incredibly diverse. And regardless of the background that you have or your lived experiences, you're going to find people here to truly connect with. And I think it's one of the awesome things about this community. Cool. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about surprises during your time with Fly or your time at the GSB. And Mike and Reba, whoever wants to take that first.
I can go first. I think one of the big surprises, kind of related to what we were just talking about, Valerie and Mike, was just how many members of the Fly community there are in the class. So Mike and I, along with some of our other club members, kicked off a program recently called Fly Pods, First-Gen Low-Income Pods. And the idea is that we meet once or twice a quarter, either virtually or in a socially distant manner, and create space to talk about our identities and any questions that we have, the kind of questions that we're seeing in the chat right now. And I think we were expecting maybe 10 people to respond, and we got closer to, I think, 40 people expressing interest in creating these spaces and facilitating these dialogues. I think one of the big surprises after kind of kicking off the experience, feeling a little out of place at times, was just realizing that there is actually a community of folks at the GSB who want to have these conversations and want to support each other.
I love that answer. I totally agree. I'll also answer this question a little bit of a different way, which is I'm surprised by how much the GSB changed the way that I think. I came in here with a pretty set mindset about what I was going to do and what I was going to get out of it. And I think everything that they promised, right, like community, the classes, the opportunities, that was all there, and that's all true. But for me, it actually took me almost a year to challenge some of these notions of what I wanted to do with my career, and I ended up, working at a nonprofit over the summer on sort of Fly related issues. And now I'm considering a career pivot that is not the safe option of going to consulting and, having my loans paid off in 2 years. And I'm doing that because I've been rubbing shoulders and having my thinking challenged by people who come from such different backgrounds. That I think that will sort of be the lesson that will be worth the 2-year journey. And I certainly wasn't expecting it coming in. Yeah. Val, should we take some questions from the crowd? It looks like we've got
let's do it. Am I just having technical Q&A? There it is. I was like, I can't see the questions. Okay, yeah, let's start with some questions from the crowd. Let's see. Here we've got one from Joel. How has the GSB helped you navigate the MBA as a first-gen student? And what are some resources for funding, not just the program, but things like housing, transportation, books, etc.?
I can get it to go. Okay. I think that once I got in, one of the first people I talked to at the GSB was one of our leaders at the financial aid department, and she was just so forthcoming. I had this very frank dialogue about kind of being the first person in my family to go to school, let alone graduate school, how self-indulgent it felt to, drop a couple $100,000 on a degree when, we were still trying to make ends meet at home, and just kind of that experience. And I found that there were a lot of folks at the financial aid department who were willing to kind of sit with me and help me understand how to portray my kind of unique financial circumstances in my forms. So I remember attaching things like Western Union statements that I had for money I sent back to Pakistan, and Venmo screenshots of when I transferred money to family members to support them. And it was just really nice to have a financial aid department that was willing to work with me and, help me kind of get the resources I needed to make this degree happen. I think there's also a lot of tips that we talk about within the Fly community around managing the money aspect of it once you're here, kind of beyond financial aid. So one of the most helpful things for me was realizing that there's a diversity of options when it comes to rent. So you can essentially live about 5 minutes from the official GSB residences in an area called Escondido Village, and your rent goes down by about, I think I paid less than half of the rent I would have to pay if I lived in the GSB residences. So just knowing that there are options if you want to just, you know, cut back on rent and have some money to go on trips with friends back when we could travel. So there's a lot of options around kind of managing rent. For events that are paid, there's lots of options to volunteer for the event and be a bus monitor, for instance, and go for free instead of, you know, shelling out a few dollars to attend. There's TA jobs on campus and note taker jobs on campus, and emergency funding if you're, you know, if something goes wrong with your family or you need resources for mental health. There's just a lot of kind of little cushions out there for folks in terms of both financial and mental security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Reba, for sharing that. I think where the GSB is really good is when you're coming from a background where you are supporting others, or you are coming from a very kind of low income background that's immediately before school. And I think there's another set of circumstances it's worth talking about, which is, what if you yourself are doing okay, but you come from a different background than your class? And I think that's kind of where I'd identify is, you know, I'm going to preface this by saying GSB is way ahead of any other business school, because most business schools don't even do financial aid at all. But I'm someone who got zero from the university, and their reasoning is, over the next 10 years, I can make enough money to pay my loans back. And because I'm not directly supporting anyone in my family, should be able to take that burden on. And it's kind of a tough pill to swallow. But the reality is, like, you come to business school to get a high paying job, among other things. And they do have programs for like loan forgiveness for folks who go into nonprofit or kind of public impact work. But there is sort of a middle ground where, if you're not in that bucket, you do have to sort of think about whether, you know, the cost of school will shape what decisions you make coming out of school. And it does kind of change your experience in school, right? So, you know, again, with COVID, it's all a little different, but, you know, there are a lot of trips that happen that are super expensive, right? Like when a third of the class goes for their trip before you show up on day one, and it costs $2,000 for a week. You know, for a lot of us, it's a really, really hard pill to swallow, even if we, you know, are not supporting relatives back home financially. And so there's a lot of kind of tricks of how to do business school on a budget, and it's frankly something we talk about a lot. And I think part of it is just accepting that you will feel the FOMO, right, when you see your friends posting ski trips on Instagram, or, you know, jetting off to Vegas for a weekend. But that's not where you get 90% of the value of the degree. Like, the 90% comes from actually getting to know people and like making connections through school. And I think it's just important to recognize that, like, while business schools have a big party culture and a big travel culture, you can get most of the experience, and it's okay to say, like, this trip is too expensive for me, or, you know, do the small stuff, like, you know, invite your friends for a barbecue where everyone chips in $10 for groceries instead of going out to a super fancy restaurant, right? There's just trade-offs, and I think it's important to recognize that they exist. But I think, you know, like, nobody comes to GSB and then leaves without a job and without a high paying job. And so you kind of just have to trust that things will also be okay, and that, like, your formula will look a little bit different coming out than it does coming in.
And I think the one thing I'll add to Mike's point, I was also one of the folks that does come from a low income background, first gen, and I didn't receive a lot of money from Stanford. And so I've been trying to navigate, you know, my 2 years here, and what does that look like for me long term, and for the support I am going to provide my family after business school. And at the end of the day, I think business school is a very personal decision. And it's almost like, you know, the risk I'm willing to take on myself, and am I willing to bet on myself? And similar to what Mike said, it's, you know, thinking about it long term in terms of how much are you going to make in, you know, 5-10 years. And what does that mean for sacrificing, you know, 2 years of for business school? So yeah, let me take a look at some of the other questions. There's a question here around imposter syndrome and finding your
Ooh,
voice.
I love
So
that. Can I take that one?
yes, please go ahead. I was just going to
Yeah.
add one more thing. So imposter syndrome, finding your voice, and psychological safety.
This is Madison's question.
Madison Lee, that's right.
Yeah. I'm really glad you asked that question, Madison. I think this is one of the places where GSB really shines. I can't compare it to other business schools, but it's definitely a strong point of this program. Is the focus of GSB is not getting you through accounting and finance and strategy class. The focus of GSB is on developing the person as a leader. And so many of the classes, and especially the best classes, are really introspective and really work through some of these questions. And it's remarkable to see how many people, even from non-fly backgrounds, struggle with imposter syndrome, psychological safety, taking risks. So it's a remarkable community. And just to give you kind of a couple of examples, there's classes like Touchy Feely where you share crazy amounts of stuff with your group and find incredible kind of personal growth through it. I took a class called Lives of Consequence, where we literally had to write and then rewrite our life stories to change our internal narratives that we tell ourselves based on kind of like the best practices in the research. Because it turns out that actually the story you tell yourself very much shapes how you think and act in the future. And there's so many classes, even more tactically, on like paths to power of like, how do you come across as more influential? How do you write? How do you speak publicly? And especially if you're coming from a background where you didn't have the chance to develop those skills, GSB will teach you, but it will also make you comfortable in using those skills to an extent that I don't think you can get, working or in a program that looks very different from ours.
Yeah, happy to add a couple things. I think Mike did a great job of speaking to some of the GSB's strengths as just generally a great business school program for FLY students and other students. I think the other thing that's helped me personally when it comes to finding my voice is just speaking up. This sounds kind of funny, but I think that it takes a decent amount of courage for FLY students to speak up in class and say actually not just FLY students, but students from any kind of minority background, female students from other countries, to just kind of speak up and say, actually, that's not going to work where I come from, or that's not going to work for me. And I think for me, like a huge part of my GSB experience is just kind of like dealing with that discomfort and raising my hand in class and in organizational behavior class and be like, actually, that leadership style won't work for a lot of women in the industry I came from. And actually, like that cultural stereotype about people from this country is, a cultural stereotype and problematic. And so I think the GSB isn't perfect. And there's a lot of times when, the curriculum can feel dated or the conversation can feel dated. And having, compassion for the professors who are trying to keep up with all of the stuff that's happening in the world and all of the diversity in our community, but also, standing up for your perspective and your community and saying, actually, I'd like to add a slightly different point of view here. That's been a huge part of my experience. And I'm really grateful to the FLY community and to kind of students from a diversity of backgrounds at the GSB who do it time and again. And the great thing is every time you do speak up and you do offer a different point of view, whether it's virtual class and people are kind of chatting and saying +1, thank you, or it's actual class and people are snapping or nodding, like there's a lot of kind of support for each other when we speak up and present a different point of view. And that in itself is, it's a burden, but it's also its own kind of psychological safety and finding voice.
Awesome, thank you both. I'm going to take Chris's question here really quick because I want to do a quick plug. So Chris is asking about any prep programs for business school that prospective students can join, like the UCLA Reordin program. I'm assuming that's what you're referring to, Chris. The other plug I'm going to make here is for MLT. MLT, Management Leadership for Tomorrow, MBA Prep, is an incredible program and a great funnel for diverse candidates that are interested in business school. So take a look at that. I'm happy to post the link in the chat in a bit, but I leverage that program to apply to the business schools that I applied to, and so I'd highly recommend. Okay, let's take a look here. From Earl, can you speak on how the GSB improved your interpersonal skills or using your voice?
Yeah, I can share. So this has been huge for me. The feedback that I got in my past jobs was that I didn't speak up enough, that I didn't fight for my own, I didn't fight for my teams. And it's because, from day one, as my first day at Bain, full-time work, landing in a client site, I didn't even know how to wear the business casual clothes that we had, right? Let alone tell CEOs what to do. Crazy, crazy imposter syndrome. So I think as Fly students, I'm gonna try to generalize here. I think we tend to be really good at reading the room and fitting in, and we tend to struggle with using our voices more and having our presence. And I loved Ariba's point of GSB gives you so many opportunities to practice that and get really good, honest feedback of how you're coming across and what worked and what didn't and what people want to know more about. And you go through so many iterations. And it starts with lead labs in the fall quarter, which everyone has to take, and then continues through most of the electives, honestly. For me, I just feel so much more comfortable in my identity and knowing who I show up as and just owning it. And I think for this community in particular, it's especially important.
Yeah, and I think
anything you guys want to add?
Yeah, I was just going to build on your point and say that there's a couple of really awesome programs at the GSB that kind of embody what Mike is talking about. So one of them is called Doc. For MBA 2s, it's every Monday. For MBA 1s, it's every Wednesday. And it's essentially just 1 to 2 MBA students talking about their life experiences. And people will share a lot of personal details and share experiences being first-gen low income or being born in a different kind of place or overcoming a kind of health issue. And it's this really wild kind of experience where you stand in front of your classmates and you talk about something deeply personal, and just kind of having that program and having other experiences like the touchy-feely class that Mike mentioned, it creates this culture where it's okay to be imperfect, it's okay to be emotional, it's okay to be sentimental, it's okay to be honest and be yourself and figure out what that even means. So there's this really special culture at the GSB that I think is hard to find at any other MBA program when it comes to just interpersonal skills, but also just being your full authentic self without any fear.
I will also add, one of the reasons that I personally came to the GSB was the Arbuckle Leadership Fellows program. So within that program, basically it's about 60 to 70 MBA 2s that are selected to coach MBA 1s through what is called lead labs, like Mike mentioned. And lead labs, similar to what Mike said, is really the beginning of your journey in terms of trying to answer the question of why would someone follow you? And so as an MBA 2, you help MBA 1s navigate this question, or at least start to navigate this question. And as part of that program, MBA 2s receive an executive coach or our Arbuckle leadership facilitator. So mine is actually a Latina woman, and I've gotten super close to her in terms of discussing, as a Latina in business school and in the workplace, what does it mean for me to have a seat at the table and what does that look like? And so she's been really instrumental in helping me find my voice. And so I think there's always opportunities, whether part of the Arbuckle program or outside of it, to connect with instructors and professors and facilitators at the GSB that can help you navigate this question. All right, let me look at
a few questions around networking and career resources. I think it might be interesting to raise that topic. So we have some questions about what the networking experience has been like, and what resources are available for the job search. One thing that's been really cool about the GSB is the fact that it's small. There's only 400 odd students here, and what that means in practice is it's not a really it's not a clearly segmented group of people, because it's small enough that it's kind of one community. And what that means in practice is yeah, like we're all in these groups, right? Like we're in Fly, and like I'm in like the Midwest Club and a few kind of like professional interest clubs and fellows, and all these communities overlap. And so it's like when I look at like Val or Reba, I'm not like, oh, I know Val from fellows. It's like, no, like I know Val from like this class and that program and like 10 other things, right? Um, and so the job search process like kind of happens in two ways. Like there's a part that's like formal recruiting through like your classic career service, like similar to what you had in undergrad. But there's a huge part that just happens spontaneously. And like, you know, GSB really encourage you to talk about what your interests are and explore them. And sort of you keep asking yourself this question, like, what would I do if I didn't have financial constraints? Or if I knew I was going to succeed, like, what would I take on? And then as you start talking about it, people start thinking with you, and there's so many crazy resources that people have access to. Like I'm recruiting right now for full-time roles in tech, and like literally every company I can think of, someone in my class knows someone there and is like, I drop them a Slack message and I have like an intro the next day. And I've had 100% success rate on people responding to those warm intros, right? So I think like the class, like it's not competitive. Like, yeah, some people go for academic honors and that's sort of their priority, but like it's not a competing environment. Like it's an extremely supportive environment, and a lot of it happens in these like weird, unexpected, organic ways. But as long as you're sort of broadcasting into the community kind of broadcasts back to you. And like I'll never forget, like I went to the first Fly event of the year last year. It was like week 2 of school, and I was like, oh, like I'm exploring like tech in the Midwest, like. And one of the guys who was a second year was like, okay, here, I know 3 people there. I'm sending you intros tomorrow. And like, it led some great conversations. And I think that's like kind of normal for people's GSB experience here. So the Fly Club itself does not like provide that many resources, but it's like, because we're not in a vacuum, like there's so much here, that as long as you put yourself out there, like it like comes to you, which is so cool.
Reba, do you have anything to add, or should we go to the next question?
We can go to the next question. I think Mike covered it really well.
Yeah, agree. I want to stay on this topic of career and career goals. Alina asks, how has your Fly identity influenced your career and life goals?
You can start with that one. I think I went to a women's college called Mount Holyoke, which I love to pieces. Highly recommend women's colleges just generally. But I think the funny part about my experience was that everybody around me was going into public service or going to work for a nonprofit. And for me, like I worked at the White House back when it was a better place under Obama, in my sophomore year. And then I worked at a bank in my junior year. And it felt like that was the spectrum. Like I could either, work in public service, or I could work for like an investment bank. And it felt like, I don't know, it felt like choosing between light and dark, and it was just very reductive and confusing. And since then, I think I've realized that you can be first-gen low income, you can pay for your mother's medical bills, you can try to get work authorization as an international student in the US, and still have a really fulfilling career that, makes you feel really energetic when you're getting up in the morning, and that there's so many opportunities out there. And so I think I did start off making a lot of choices based on which jobs could sponsor my visa and which jobs could pay for my parents' rent in Pakistan. But since then, I think it's been an interesting kind of exploratory process of, testing things out and saying, actually, there's banking and consulting and tech and product. And, I like this thing better than that thing. And all of these can support me as an aspiring immigrant and support me as a, Fly student supporting their family. So it can feel really overwhelming when you're starting off, and that feeling of, this is so unfair, so many people around me don't have to worry about this stuff and I do. Like, those feelings are very valid, but there's just so much richness in terms of career opportunities, even with some of those constraints, that is easy to overlook when you're starting out.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, do you have something to add there?
Yeah, that's just hit like so many nerves, right? Yeah, like it's hard to get used to having privilege, and being at business school gives you a lot of privilege. And one of the ways you can use that privilege is to go and find the exact opportunity that sort of lets you do something you're interested by, that will pay you well, and that's consistent with your values and your identities, right? Um, and and it's like very like it's not easy to find these jobs, but like you have the space to do that. And then the extent to which your identity kind of like affects you, like that's a very personal question. I know for myself, it's made me more risk averse. So, if the idea of like starting a startup seemed daunting before GSB, doing it with a whole bunch of debt is even more daunting. And I think that's probably why, like, when you look at startup founders, they're overwhelmingly white, male, affluent individuals, like more than most other industries. And there's a reason for that, right? And so I think like the world is changing. I think there's a lot more openness to diverse people in business. But I think there is a little bit of a reality check where you speak to alums and a lot of them say like, oh, I took a safer job, paid for my school, and then used my network to like do something crazy, and other people are comfortable doing something crazy right off the bat. And it's personal, but it's definitely there, and it's helpful to at least kind of acknowledge it.
Thank you, Mike. I want to get one more question in terms of career and jobs. Laura Munoz asks, have you felt that because you will be paying off business school, you need to choose a high-paying job after graduating from the GSB that might not be as close to something you're passionate about? It's a loaded question, Laura.
It is.
Mike, do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll I'll take a first stab at it. So speaking for myself, yes. Again, like I came in, I accepted a consulting offer before school started because I was like, all right, I'll get this paid for in 2 years, and then I'll move on with my life. And then as time wore on, I was like, wait, I don't want to do consulting. It's a waste of my time. I won't learn that much. How can I get out of this? And that's kind of where I am. I'll be honest about it. I went to work for a nonprofit this summer because I wanted to see what it was like to work on something really mission driven. What I came away from was like the number one thing I can do to support this cause is to make more money, because it's not like they don't have smart people who are working on it. It's that they're short on resources, right? And so I think for me personally, it's sort of added another reason to the list of why I should get like a well-paying career first and then take care of the other things. And then within that, I've kind of been thinking, okay, well, seeing how well GSB alumni do, like consistently, I'm more willing to take risks than I was 2 years ago, right? So I'm now more comfortable with the idea of like, hey, let me get a job that's more technical that I like. So I'm recruiting for data science, which is not the most traditional career path. But I'm like, let me go do this. It pays pretty well. It's a good match for my interests, and I'll just trust that on a 10-year horizon, it will be fine, right? Because I figure I'll be more successful doing the thing I'm good at, and my career will go better than if I take something that's short term and money focused. But again, I also recognize that I have the luxury of like, I'm not, supporting family, or I'm not in some like crazy financial situation. I just have $0 in savings, and my parents have $0 in savings, and 10 years from now, I'll have to be paying for their retirement.
Yeah, I think similar story to Mike. I went from consulting, so I did finance/consulting, and then pivoted to tech. And I think that the added burden of being international is interesting, because there's a lot of really awesome tech companies that don't sponsor visas for international students. And so I think it's been a filter of, can they pay me a 6-figure salary so that I can feed myself, my family, and pay the loans that I'm taking on right now? Also, can they sponsor my visa so I don't get deported after I graduate? So fun stuff. And so I think those filters have been pretty important. But like I said, careers are long. Like what you do after the GSB is not necessarily what you're known for like 30 years from now, and everything is sort of incremental. And that's kind of how I went about it. I spent my summer working at Apple, and I'm going back. I'm working on accessibility, but not financial accessibility, more like accessibility of technology for people who are blind, deaf, had a motor disability. And so kind of, exploring my interest in just making the world more egalitarian and trying to approach that from angles that pay for my visa and for my family. So I would encourage you to be aware of those constraints, but also just know that they're not the boss of you, and there's fulfilling careers out there that pay the bills and make you happy.
And I'm going to chime in on this one here. So for me, being the daughter of immigrant parents, my dad actually started his own business here in the States when he was 40. And so I was able to see firsthand just how difficult it is for diverse entrepreneurs to build a business without having the social capital of someone who, for example, comes from Stanford. And so for me, things have really come full circle, because now I'm spending my time at Stanford. I'm actually interning at Harlem Capital, which is a VC fund in New York that is dedicated to investing solely in diverse founders. So for me, it's like full circle. Here I am trying to support people like my dad that don't necessarily have that social capital to raise capital. And so I had a conversation with a partner at a VC fund actually last week, and she gave me wonderful advice that I'm really excited to share with you all. And she shared that, as children of immigrants, your parents come to this country to offer you a better life and better opportunities, and for you to be happier than perhaps they were in their home country. And so however you define happiness, you should honor their sacrifices and do whatever makes you happy. And if that's choosing a job that pays a high salary, like, that's awesome. But if that means choosing a job that maybe you take a little bit of a salary cut, but you're energized every day, that's also awesome. And so I guess the advice here is think about whatever it is that is going to bring you joy and energize you, and whatever motivates you, and pursue that. And that can obviously mean so many different things to so many different people. Okay.
Love that advice, Val. Can I pick a question next?
Yeah, please help me sort through them. There's a ton.
so I see one that's a nice segue. It's asking about like dealing with the residual shame of being from a fly background and how that translates into the application process. So first of all, the shame is extremely real, right? We all carry some version of our own, but it's there, right? I think a huge learning from this whole experience has been that owning your story and being comfortable with it and leading with it makes you powerful. And trying to bury it and pretend it's not there takes away from your power and your ability to succeed. The application process for GSB is specifically designed to look for people who are introspective, self-aware, humble, like really hardworking, and have done impressive things, but really aware of themselves, right? It's not just the strict like resume check. And so I would say, like, if that's what your story is about, right? Like, if that's what really matters to you, then like just go for it, right? Like, take the risks, be vulnerable, because the people who read those essays in the admissions department are really, really special and really caring, and they want to see who you are, right? And I don't know about you guys, like, that's what my essay was about, right? It was about this background. And so I would just say, just own it. Like, no one's going to ding you for it. And there's, I can't speak for other schools, but here they're not looking for you to play to the stereotype of an MBA student in 1980s America. Like, they want to see who you are, right? So just own it.
Yeah, I think what Mike said, it's funny. I think there are environments in the corporate world and the business world where you don't want to, point out that you're the only woman in the room, or that you're the only brown person in the room, and you want to kind of like keep all your childhood traumas growing up as first-gen low income, like on the down low. But your application should not be one of those places. Like, I think you should talk about any kind of adversity you've overcome as a first-gen low-income student, how you've handled that, kind of the complexities of that identity, navigating kind of family, like familial conversations. There was a question about that. like Mike said, you should really just own the story. This is, there are people who have to think hard about what adversities to talk about overcoming. First-gen low-income students are not those people. So really, what Mike said, own your story.
Awesome. So I think very similar question, but with a different lens, I think. From Christina, are your peers aware of your academic constraints, and how do they accommodate / demonstrate their consideration?
Val, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can take this. So I have been very open about my upbringing and all the identities that I bring with me to a room. So a particular example that I can share was before COVID, the GSB would essentially take a 24-hour trip to Vegas. And so super exciting, a lot of fun, get on a plane literally right after class on Tuesday, is it? I'm blanking. I think it's Tuesday night. And you get on a plane and then you party all night, and then Wednesday morning you come back, and then you sleep all of Wednesday. So within that, some of my classmates were actually trying to grab dinner in Vegas, and we're selecting among very expensive meals that would easily cost about $300 per person. And so I'm just not in a position to be doing that right now. And the GSB is so wonderful because I felt very comfortable letting my peers know, like, hey, can we maybe think about other options for that can be a bit more inclusive to not just me, but others in the group. And the group was so overwhelmingly open to considering other options. And it wasn't even like an awkward conversation. It was like, oh yeah, for sure. Like the more the merrier. And then that was that. And then we started looking at other restaurants in Vegas. And so I feel like the wonderful thing about the GSB is that your classmates are so excited to get to know folks from diverse backgrounds and experiences and lived experiences. And as long as you're open and honest and vulnerable, people are incredibly receptive to that. And I'm sure there's other examples that I can think of, but.
Yeah, I can add to that quickly. So I didn't go to Vegas Film because I, just didn't feel necessary from an economic point of view or experiential point of view. And I think that there's, like Valeria said, like there's options on where to go for dinner, and there's options on how to spend a Tuesday night. And there are just people from all kinds of like dispositions and backgrounds. So there's a lot of acceptance of wherever you're from. Not exactly an economic consideration, but I think one of my most intimate experiences with the GSB community was when my mother passed away earlier this year. And I, came back home, and there was someone picking me up from the airport, and my fridge was stocked with food, and somebody was doing my homework. It was just, people kind of like meeting me halfway and asking me, like doing stuff for me before I even knew that I needed food in my fridge or I needed my homework done. And not exactly kind of economic considerations, but more like mental health considerations. People are just incredibly considerate and accepting at the GSB, partly because of this culture of like vulnerability and oversharing that we're part of. And it's 100% okay to ask your peers for help, whether it's on money or family stuff or anything else that's going on in your life.
Yeah, that's a really powerful story. Yeah, I think people are really caring. I think in my experience here, a lot of people just don't think about money, and when you say, hey, this trip is a little expensive for me, I'm not going to go to Hawaii for a week or something, like people are just like, oh, okay, cool, like we'll see you next week, and like nobody kind of thinks twice about it. But it is important to set those boundaries for yourself. Like I found it really helpful to just have like a spreadsheet of like roughly how much I'm kind of budgeting for myself for this quarter, and within that not feeling guilty, and above that just telling people like, hey, I can't make this trip, sorry. And I think people are really supportive, and I think people like might not guess that that's even the first thing that's on your mind. So again, like the degree to which you want to share it. But yeah, I can't think of a single bad interaction. And I actually came to Stanford for undergrad, and that was different, right? Like to be a part of the social scene, you know, Greek life, going out to eat, going out to bars, like nonstop. But I think GSB is way better because I think people are just mature and understanding. Yeah.
Thanks, Mike and Ariba. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about allyship, because I think it's so important across all identities that will be represented this week during Diversity Week. And so Cleo asks, can you talk about the allyship with non-first gen students? How is the club involving non-first gen students? And I'm happy to talk about allyship at Stanford from a diversity committee perspective, but if y'all want to address it from the fly
would love to hear that. Let me give you the kind of the quick fly version, which is we don't really do it, and maybe we should. Our priority is on creating a community for students who do identify, and we very openly invite allies and reach out across campus. And I don't know how many of the people in the pods are like fly students versus allies, because that's pretty small and confidential. I think talk, actually, what Ariba was talking about earlier, serves as a really powerful vehicle for allyship, because I'd say probably, you know, a quarter of the stories that I've heard in talk that have had full, you know, 300-400 people listening from our class, probably about a quarter of them touch on fly type stuff. And people are incredibly supportive, and it just builds a whole new level of empathy. But again, this is one of those things where I think we can probably do more of it. And I think it's up to people in the club to decide how much it matters to us. And frankly, like if any of you guys, you know, come to GSB and decide it's right for you and want to take that on, like I think there's a huge amount of room to do more than what we're doing.
Awesome. And I can take it from just a broad allyship perspective. So I sit on the Student Association Diversity Committee, which essentially is in charge of anything diversity related that impacts the student experience. So one of our big events is actually training MBA 1 students on concepts of diversity, equity, and inclusion via this concept of pods, which are essentially small groups of 4 to 5 students that are led by MBA 2s who have been trained by professional diversity and inclusion facilitators. And so as part of that curriculum that we're building, we're actually working across all identity groups to build an allyship training that is hopefully will be released next year in our winter quarter. And that is basically aimed at helping MBA 1s and MBA 2s think about this question of how can I be a better ally to insert identity group here, whether it's gender, whether it's race, whether it's socioeconomic status. And so I say all of that because there is so much energy within the student community to improve our allyship efforts across all identities. A lot of that was driven by the events of this summer, actually events that have been happening in our country for many, many years, but most visibly this summer. And so I think it just speaks to the commitment that GSBers have to concepts of diversity and inclusion and understanding those concepts if they haven't necessarily been exposed to them in the past. Okay, so we have about 6 minutes left. Do you guys think we can squeeze in another question and then close things off?
Sounds good.
All right, is there a question, Ariba, you wanna, okay, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I thought the question from Jimmy is really interesting. If you pursue entrepreneurial endeavors, how did you find a way to build a company? Well, I think there's a question from a couple of people here about families, just like having conversations with families. I think Jimmy alluded to it, and then Kelly also alludes to it. Just like, given that business school is a foreign concept to many students' families, I'm curious how you navigated conversations with your family. And then Jimmy has another one on supporting family. I was wondering if we want to talk about our chats and our support with our families quickly.
It's a fascinating question. You guys are very creative and really hitting on the good stuff.
So Ariba, is the
start,
question more around just how are we supporting our families now, if that's the case for us?
Yeah, I was trying to hit two birds with one stone. I think there's two questions. One is around supporting family, and the other one is justifying the decision to go to graduate school. And I was just going to add that it did feel very self-indulgent to spend a lot of money on your education and to explain to your family that you were going to do this. And in my case, I only felt comfortable going to business school once I had a certain amount of savings. Like I did the math of how much money I sent my family back home. And once I'd accumulated enough to be able to do that for 2 years with no income, I decided to go to business school. And so the conversation with them was very much like, hey, y'all, I'm doing this for myself. Your like paycheck is not going to stop like arriving in the mail. Don't worry about that. And I think they were generally pretty supportive once I was able to make that clear. But just generally, I think it is hard to navigate these career hurdles and make these decisions for yourself when you haven't had other people in your family do that in the past, and kind of not only just have the burden of making the decisions, but also of justifying them to yourself and to family members. I just wanted to be cognizant of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I had a very different experience. That so my parents grew up in Poland, which it was communist at the time, so definitely about the opposite of having an MBA program, as you can imagine. And I had a lot of family pressure to go to graduate school. It got to the point where, you know, every week or two, my parents would bring it up of like, you only have a bachelor's, you're not gonna do well in life. Like, when are you applying to school? And they could not understand the concept of how freaking expensive business school is. I was like, look, like I have busted my ass, you know, paying San Francisco rent for 4 years to save up this tiny little amount of savings that's my like financial security, and you're making me go to something that's going to cost 5 times what I've saved up, right? And it was a big source of conflict. And like what made that better was bringing my parents into the decision and being really transparent and direct about like, you know, like, here's how much money I have, here's how long I'll be paying this off for, like, here's the ways it will limit me. And I think appreciating that, like, they were on my side, like all of that was like the best of intentions, even in a world that, you know, they're not as familiar with. And so I think like finding that common ground was really important. And like, I don't think I would have been happy here if it wasn't my decision to come in the end. So it's kind of funny, like I was like pushing them off for a few years, and then I eventually came around to being like, okay, like I want to go to business school for my reasons. And then they were like, we told you so. And I was like, shut up. But it was quite cute in the end. All that to say, like, I think it's really important to make your own decision and remember that, like, I think our parents are really influential people in general in our lives. But we sort of have to like use our best judgment and kind of approach it with empathy, but, you know, do what we think is right in the end.
Awesome. Thank you both. So we have about a minute left. Mike or Reba, do any of you want to share any last words of wisdom for our attendees? If not, I'm happy to share application advice.
I'll just say, if you're on the fence about applying and belonging is the main thing holding you back, you will belong here. You will find your community. You will be valued, and you will grow. So I hope that, you know, we could shed some light on that, and that you can kind of have a better sense of it.
Yeah, I'll add that sometimes as first-gen low-income students, it's very easy to undersell yourself because you have awesome parents and families, but you don't always have the kind of role models in terms of career and educational backgrounds. And so you can't see yourself in certain positions, whether it's being a panelist on this panel next year, or, you know, being in the job that you're dreaming of. I just encourage you to not undersell yourself. If there's something that you really want by way of career, entrepreneurship, or school, go out and get that thing for yourself, because you're probably good enough, and you're probably underselling yourself a little bit.
I would say exactly the same thing, except without the probably. Like, you guys are good enough.
Thanks, Mike.
Awesome. Well, we are a minute over. Mike and Ariba, thank you so much. And everyone in attendance, thank you all so much. We're excited to hopefully see you all at the GSB in the near future. And Will, I'm not sure if you want me to hand it off to you, but thank you all so much.
A huge, huge, huge thank you to our panelists, Valeria as our moderator. This has been one of the most powerful and impactful sessions we've had all week. You didn't see me behind the scenes, but my heart was so full, and you give me so much joy to be able to work with you. So with everybody in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. We do have events all week long, and I'd love to continue seeing you throughout.